It's a special Joe and Joe Weather Show podcast tonight because we have with us Jon Molik of the podcast Headlines and History. You see the young man's picture there on the screen. And he's going to be talking about all sorts of stuff that we don't normally talk about here on the Joe and Joe Weather Show because, weather is important to us on a day to day basis, but it's also important to the military. It plays a role in foreign affairs and there's all sorts of other tangents that we can go on. So we're going to do that tonight on the Joe and Joe Weather Show podcast, which is brought to you by Tempest by Weatherflow. The revolutionary Tempest weather station is yours. If you purchase one from the Tempest website, and if you do, you join the fastest growing observing weather network on the planet. The link is on the descriptor to this podcast. Use the coupon code SPRING 2024 because if you do, you will get
10% off.
And welcome to everybody on the chat board tonight. And welcome to you, Jon, joining tonight's Joe and Joe Weather Show podcast. And also a big welcome to all of those. We have a lot of folks that lurk in the background. They just sort of watch quietly. Some of them are more famous than others. I'm not going to name drop at the moment. But subscribe to my YouTube channel so you don't miss podcasts like this, or our nightly podcast, which is Sunday through Thursday at 7:35 p.m. and the occasional Friday and Saturday when storms are afoot, in which case we'll let you know ahead of time, change the schedule around a little bit. Be sure to turn your notifications on so you don't miss us. And if you like the show, hit the like button. So, Jon, welcome to the Joe and Joe Weather Show podcast. Now, we've been promoting this podcast for tonight, the last couple of nights, and just to remind everybody, or if you're just here for the first time, Jon Molik is an intelligence officer in the New York Army National Guard, and his job is to provide the commanders how weather and terrain will impact operations for both enemy and friendly forces. And that's something I have to say. I never, we're we're pretty much forecasters here, Jon, and we we cover weather from day to day. But this was not something that I came to mind to me. I mean, I knew that the military, of course, obviously, weather is is a big deal, but in terms of the intricacies of it, and maybe talk about perhaps what it is you do and how you do it.
Yeah, thanks. Well, first, thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate it, and hopefully, I can provide some interesting context to this whole weather piece when it comes to the military. So, let me first say just a couple of things. One, I'm definitely not a meteorologist, so I don't know I don't really know how the weather does what it does and why it does what it does. But we take the end state data and we turn that into assessments for the commander. So that we'll make that clear. And then the second thing is, if we get into any conversations about foreign affairs in particular, some of those military conflicts or something, if you have questions about that, I want to make clear I speak tonight for myself as an intelligence officer, and I'm not speaking for the Army. I got to just get that caveat in there. I can speak for the Army during the day, but at night I'm speaking for myself. So,
sure.
Okay. So here's the interesting part. So most people think that intelligence, and rightly so, is focused on the enemy. And, we do all of these, us intelligence officers, we do all of this information collection and we analyze all this stuff and we try to make assessments on that so commanders can make decisions. That's really ultimately at the end of the day what intelligence is for. But one of the key aspects of that is not just how intelligence personnel assess enemy operations and enemy capabilities, but it's also the objective, real realities of the battle space, right? So that includes the terrain, that includes weather, that includes what we call civil considerations. So the society of a country we may be operating in, all of these things that just exist and they're just there because they're there. It's also our job in the intelligence world to analyze those things and present the information on how they affect both us. When I say us, I mean friendly, and the enemy, on top of what the enemy is doing on themselves, right? And the decisions they're making to try to hamper whatever missions that we're conducting. So,
no, go ahead if you got a question.
These forecasts that you're providing are not just like normally a person would tune on their radio and you, well, tonight it's going to be cloudy and tomorrow it's going to be bright and sunny, whatever. These forecasts had to be absolutely specific for the project or for the what was being
Like a
planned.
mission.
Yeah, like a mission.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely.
Yep.
And so in that case, you needed to provide, I suppose, specific temperatures, wind conditions, and not so much probability of precipitation, but you really had to probably tell the people in charge of the mission, well, we do believe that sometime between, let's say, 2Z and 4Z, or in other words, um, uh, 10 p.m. and midnight or whatever, that we're expecting the rain to begin, and it could become rather heavy. Those that was the kind of forecast I presume that you had to provide on a regular basis to whatever clientele or whoever group captain you were providing this forecast for.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for using the Zulu time, the time zone there, which is actually exactly what we do in the military. We all go off Zulu when we're conducting these operations. But let me make sure that I'm clear. So the Air Force is the entity responsible for actually providing the forecast itself. So the Air Force is going to tell us, and when I say us, I mean the Army or the Marines. I can't really speak for the Navy. It's a little bit different. They have their own weather process. But when it comes to ground forces, so Army and Marine Corps, the Air Force will provide us that probability statement. They'll say things like tomorrow it's going to be 71 degrees and we have a 30% chance of precipitation. That's the data that I get. My job is to take all of that forecasting data, present it to the commander as is, but then make sure that I give him the so what. And that's ultimately everything we do in Intel is telling the bosses so what. I say, so 71 degrees with a 20% chance of precipitation in the type of fight that we're having tomorrow. The so what means we can collect with our sensors with 100% capacity. The enemy cannot, whatever that means. I got to give the why it all matters in every single piece of that weather data to the boss. So I'll sometimes even the Air Force folks will present the data, the raw data. They'll be the ones that'll stand up and say, "Okay, sir, it's going to be clear tomorrow, and visibility is going to be X, and precipitation is going to be Y." What that matters to you, I have no idea. Let me turn to the Intel guys, and then the Intel bubbas will be the ones that provide that. So what? And
Did you
then
ever get, did you ever get, for example, a scenario where the person who you're speaking with was looking for fair weather or clear skies and sunny, and then you had to turn around and say, well, tomorrow we're expecting increasing clouds with a chance by later on in the day, precipitation, rain, gusty winds, or whatever. And that's not what that person was looking for and hoping to hear from you. And did he?
oh,
Did,
100%. Yeah. So that happens in a training environment all the time. So when Army units get ready to train in these big command post exercises, they throw these things at you and they try to ensure that you're going to get tripped up and make it as difficult for you as possible. But in the real world, it happened often. So I've deployed 3 times: Iraq '05, Afghanistan in 12, and then Kuwait in 2020. And in my capacity in Iraq in '05, I worked very closely with our intelligence collection folks, and those are the ones that provide data so those platforms can go out and collect information. And as you know, I mean, most of the platforms we use are either air breathers or they're even further up and they're in space. So we absolutely, numerous times when I was there for a year, commanders would be planning operations, say 7, 10, 15, 20, 30 days in advance, because it takes a long time to get your logistics and sustainment and planning, all of that stuff together. And then I can't tell you what's going to happen in 30 days. I mean, I can give you historical data and give you a kind of an idea, and the boss can make a decision to say, well, I'm going to do this in the dry season as opposed to the wet season or something, right? But absolutely, 3, 4 days before something kicks off, the weather turns, a front's coming in, whatever it is, and now I've got to present to the boss, hey, if you go ahead and make this operation, if you kick it off as you want to, sir, you're going to be down, I don't know, 40% of your collection assets. I'm not going to be able to fly, not me personally, but the Air Force is not going to be able to fly, say, the MQ-9 Reapers that we wanted to use to get this information because the cloud cover is going to block our ability to take images and video. And so now the commander has to assume risk and decide if he wants to go forward without the ability to see as well as he wanted to, he or she, or if he wants to push it off like they did on D-Day 80 years ago.
Yeah, the
Also,
D,
go ahead, Joe. I'm
D-Day.
sorry.
Sorry. No, I'm just going to say we all know in the case of D-Day with Eisenhower, he was relying very heavily on his meteorologist. In fact, D-Day originally was scheduled for June the 5th, and I believe that his chief meteorologist, who was providing him with all the weather, said, you don't want June the 5th. We may get a break on the 6th. And based upon that, I believe Eisenhower said, okay, then we'll change everything around and go with the June the 6th for the time when we're planning the big attack. But I'm just mentioning this in the fact that I was asking you if you had ever encountered someone who you're telling the forecast to who wanted something converse or exactly opposite to what you're telling him. I'm wondering whether or not that person would have said to you something to the effect like, "Well, you don't apparently know how important this is to us that we need fair weather. Let me explain to you once again," as if almost as if you were the one who was controlling the weather. You were only, of course, the messenger, but it's almost as
Sure.
if that person was pleading his case to you in order to get the nice weather. Has that ever happened with you, or?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I've run into a scenario or either my colleagues where, they were trying to influence whether we knew what the weather was or if we could somehow make wave a magic wand and change things. But I will say that they ass- what's the word that I'm looking for? Accepting the fact that the weather is what it is, we have received pressure to say, okay, well, you normally say if the weather is X, then this equipment can't do Y. But is that really true? And how far can I push the limit? And, if the visibility is 3 miles, for example, and the book says you shouldn't operate helos or rotary aircraft in this environment without 4 kilometers visibility. Can I really do it with 3? And how far am I pushing that limit? That has absolutely happened again, because at the end of the day, all of the information we have, all of the doctrine we use, all the regulations we use, all of those are frameworks. At the end of the day, the commander's in charge. And the commander, as long as he or she is not making an unlawful or unethical order, they can do anything that they want. And so it's all how much risk they want to assume. And so, yes, we've definitely been in that position where they're like, now tell me the truth, chief. Can I really do this at 3 clicks visibility or can I not? And then the challenge of being an officer like myself, and it's not even just intel officers, but anybody else working on a staff, is how much are you willing to talk to the boss and just say, sir, you may not like it, but it is what it is. And if you want to take my rank and kick me out, you're going to have to do it. But it is what the truth is.
I'm kind of wondering also, um, in a situation where we're not at, if we weren't, we're not at war. I'm
Sure.
trying to put this into some context here. So let's suppose we are at war with a certain nation, okay,
Mhm.
um, and they decide to black out all the current weather information. How do you get around that?
Well, there's a civilian backbone, if you will, that the military can rely on, and it's not just for weather satellites and other weather assets. It's for a lot of things. We can use a civilian backbone for communications technology and other things. And there's a whole portion of the military that builds contracts and develops relationships. For example, like we're working together with Elon Musk's team in SpaceX right now to use communication technology downrange, just like Ukraine is doing. Um, as a matter of fact, using the same company. But there's also a military only backbone to that technology that only we have access to. And the only way that we could lose access to that is if the adversary knew exactly where those capabilities were in time and space and then affected them in some way, right? And literally that would be knocking a satellite out of orbit or whatever that was. So we get the best information when we can use all of our assets, but if need be, we can go straight military and still get what we need.
That's interesting. You mentioned Elon Musk with, I suppose, SpaceX. I can remember during the space shuttle era, for many years. The shuttle, of course, could not fly if there were certain weather criteria that could not be met, and yet there were occasions when those criteria were not being met, and then there was some pressure that was being put on the meteorologists. I believe the Air Force was responsible for those forecasts for the shuttle. Some pressure sometimes was put on where they were being asked, specifically what is the absolute limit, and sometimes they've even were asked can you sign a waiver if the
Mm.
wind was not quite matching the criteria, if it was a little stronger, a little
Mm.
gustier than what was supposed to be based upon the criteria, they'd have a waiver signed for that or whatever. It's very
Yeah.
interesting. That's why I asked the initial question about, have you ever faced some situation where somebody, in the hierarchy, the higher ups, was kind of talking to you and saying, well, you realize, of course, blah 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 blah, and
Yeah.
we really need this weather. So that's
Yeah. Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
that's what I was alluding to, and
And
the
we
fact
needed
that
it yesterday.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Well, if you look, you bring up a great point about D-Day, but it ties into your question here. If you dive into the whole weather aspect of that of the Operation Overlord, General Eisenhower at the time was asking for 5-day forecasts in his for the ability to plan, and they didn't exist back then. You could barely get 24 hours with any regularity and with any accuracy, but he wanted 5-day forecasts no matter what. So I could imagine what it was like one of the individuals that you were referring to was the British officer who was the chief meteorologist for the operation, Captain Stagg. He was in a position where he had to tell the boss what the weather was going to be in 96 hours. And what does he know? He's going to go off historical data, but General Eisenhower wants to know, and he's about to, impart on the largest land invasion in the history of combat. And he's waiting on this one guy to say, it's going to be okay. There's enough illumination and the tide is going to be low enough. And I'm sure he went to sleep at night thinking to himself, like, what am I going to do? I can't not tell him the truth, but God, General Eisenhower, we got to get this thing over with. So what's a challenge, no doubt.
History is, excuse me, history is, I don't know if littered is the right word, but, uh, you know, I seem to recall that Hitler did not listen to his meteorologists when they told him, you know, going into Russia, going into
Yeah.
Russia in November, and battling through the winter is not exactly the best idea. And
Yeah.
we can go back further when a little guy called named Napoleon
Sure.
uh, had, did the same thing. Um, and just in the context of World War II, and you and I were talking about this before the show started. Uh, a lot of people here are not are too young to go back that far, and so they don't know that weather information to an extent was blacked out
Mhm.
to folks in the U.S. But you were saying that it's still because I'm trying to think of the fact that if something like that were to happen now, there's so much access to so much weather information that's out there, be it our own, and it's all on the internet. And I'm just trying to fathom how they would even try to do that, given the technology that we live with today.
Yeah, I don't think it would be so there's two ways to look at it. There's two aspects to this point. And one is it would be impossible because so many other the access on the internet and the amount of satellites that are out there in particular and the people that are watching this stuff, there's just too much of it. You wouldn't be able to um keep your hands off of it, if you will. But the other thing that's different today is as than it was back then was there really was um not only a science to weather, but there was an art, if you will. And there were meteorologists who were really, really good and those that weren't. And there were technologies that certain countries have had that other countries didn't. And so you could imagine a time when the United States had access to weather data because of its technology that Japan just didn't have. And so you couldn't and you wouldn't want to pass that information to the general public because you could conceivably be helping the Japanese or the Germans or whatever part of the war you're discussing, give them information they didn't have. That doesn't exist anymore. You could block out everybody in the United States and Japan and Ukraine and Russia. They're all going to get their own weather anyway. So it wouldn't help anybody to block anything because there's just so much data out there.
And I
So
don't know how many people are. I don't know how many people are aware of this, but right after Pearl Harbor, weather information was very hard to come by if you were the average person who wanted to know if it was going to be sunny tomorrow. There were the New York Times, which always prided itself on putting a weather map from the United States Weather Bureau and a complete forecast for not only New York City but other adjacent states, and then all of that was gone. And the only thing that you could find in the New York Times during World War II for the weather was up in the upper right-hand corner of the headline page where it would say fair today, cloudy tomorrow. That was it. And on radio, you were not allowed to give weather reports unless it was a major situation, like if there was a hurricane or a big snowstorm coming. Yeah, maybe they would allow that to happen. But more often than not, if you wanted weather, both in the news media and on newspapers and the reason was that they felt that if they did that, that the Germans or the Japanese would utilize that information to their advantage to know what was going on and plan a possible attack based upon the weather that was being put forth by our own weather bureau in the states. And in fact, I heard one story where there was a German U-boat or a submarine that was off the coast of the Mid-Atlantic area, and we captured it and brought it on to the coast, and the people on board, the Germans, were arrested or whatever, and they found a copy of the Old Farmer's Almanac on
yeah,
on that submarine, and they were using that or trying to use that to try to anticipate what the weather was going to be. It shows you how important weather was back in the 40s during World War II.
Yeah, no doubt.
A couple of questions from the chat from the folks watching tonight. Greg
Sure.
Carlberg uh, asked, how much stock does the armed forces take into account for accurate weather info in regards to their training and in missions?
A lot, because the armed forces actually does, and I'll speak specifically for the Army, but they do a really good job of realistic training, especially if you go to a combat training center. So either the Reserve Center, the JRTC down in the South, or you go to NTC out of Fort Irwin, California. Weather is always played a role in all of that training. And again, they actually make weather scenarios more challenging, just so you're prepared and the commander's prepared for dealing with those problems. So, for example, we went to Kuwait in 2020. Every single day in Kuwait, practically minus 3 or 4 days a year, it is hot and it is sunny and it is humid near the water. It never changes. It's awful. But it doesn't help if we're training to deploy to Kuwait and just use that weather scenario and never throwing a curveball, because it doesn't exercise the staff and it doesn't prepare the command. So you absolutely use the weather in not only in its realistic sense, but almost in an exaggerated sense. And then not, that's from a command perspective, right? Because I spent a lot of time inside behind computers and stuff like that as an intel guy. And then when you're dealing with the combat arms folks, the artillery and armor and infantry soldiers, they're in the weather, right? And they train all over the world and they put them in the worst weather conditions that they can. So even on an individual basis, the weather is part of their training cycle. So they're prepared. So absolutely.
Ruben Fairchild on the chat board. This is an interesting question. He said, did you assist with the Hurricane Sandy response? And if you did, how did you approach that?
Oh, that's a great question, actually, because half of my responsibility is being a National Guard officer, and particularly, I'm the director of intelligence and security for the New York National Guard. So I'm responsible for both the Army and Air, every individual that's a part of those two services here in New York. And my military nomenclature is the J2. So I'm a joint intelligence officer and I work on the adjutant general staff. Okay. And half of my responsibility is doing security stuff and protecting information and protecting soldiers and airmen and those things and providing foreign threat information. But the other side is domestic response, because the National Guard, as you imagine and as you know, is heavily responsible for helping law enforcement and citizens when it comes to weather crises or other things. But oftentimes in New York, it's weather. It's blizzards in Buffalo, right? Is
Right.
often what we're dealing with. So I particularly wasn't working at headquarters during Sandy, but so I didn't have an individual response to that operation. However, we did activate thousands and thousands of soldiers to respond when Sandy came up the East Coast. Now, when we do a domestic response like that, it isn't so much we in the military that's dealing with the weather aspect. I mean, we have access to NOAA and all of these other uh, agencies, right? FEMA, all these other agencies are going to help us with the weather aspect.
I was
It's
going to
more,
ask you, do you work, do you coordinate with them and
oh,
work with
absolutely.
them in these situations?
Yep, yep. So because in a domestic response, I don't have that same responsibility um, to provide the commander how the weather is going to affect enemy and friendly so much. It's really whatever NOAA is going to provide in terms of, the depth of the snow or the wind and those type of things. And I'll tell him, or my staff and I will tell him, hey, sir, if we get 6 inches per hour at this rate or whatever, you're going to end up needing Humvees. You can't use SUVs, right? It's going to be too much. So we can kind of get into that assessment piece, but really the weather is done. 95% of weather stuff in a domestic response is done by the civilians. The military gets involved with the response with the public and helping them dig out. So we're doing things like bringing food, knocking on doors, plowing, helping getting ambulances to homes that people are dug in and they can't get out, say in Buffalo again in a blizzard. So, or we're cutting down fallen trees and getting them off the roads. All those type of post-event responses is really what the military in a domestic perspective is responsible for.
Was the Guard involved at all? I'm just trying to think back to the Hurricane Katrina response
Oh yeah. So,
when the levees broke, because that was
oh
huge.
yeah, absolutely. So that was actually a unique scenario too in Katrina, because it was such an event that President Bush at the time actually activated active army. So what we call Compo One, Component One um, airframes from the 82nd Airborne, which is traditionally not something we do here in the U.S. We leave all of that stuff to the Guard and our state status. The Constitution clearly wants us to keep the military faced on the foreign threats, and they want the National Guard and law enforcement faced towards the domestic responses and whatever those are. And so the fact that Katrina was such an event, and we utilized so many National Guard assets, and then ran out of them, run out, but they were pressed to such an extent that the president felt obligated to ask the 82nd Airborne under some exigent circumstances to bring some of their helicopters in to get some of these people off the roofs of their homes, if you will. So it wasn't just the Guard; it was the active army as well. It was actually very controversial when he did that. But
Have you ever put out a forecast that you felt was a good forecast and that actually things turned out to be pretty much on target? Maybe something was off a little bit, or something didn't quite match up with what you had predicted, and you had somebody again in the hierarchy or the upper echelon say, "Well, our forecasters gave us the wrong information. They were wrong. They were dead wrong, and it's very unfortunate." And blah blah blah. Have you ever run into something like that?
yeah, um, I not really, and I wish I had a funny story or an example of that, but I have to say, I've been in 27 years, and I'll say that even from the beginning of my time in 97 till now, the weather folks from the Air Force and sometimes working with the civilians, they've always been pretty good. And I haven't
Of
really come
course we
across
are.
this. Yeah, 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 yeah. And you know what? It does get better and better as the years go on. I will
In
say
spite
that.
of what people say, yes, that is
Yeah,
that is true.
I
yep, we're
only
up for,
I only mentioned that, and Joe, I think knows what I'm alluding to here. Is that over the years we have been putting out forecasts on this channel, our weather channel, and also on our respective Facebook pages. And when something happens that doesn't seem to, or something that we've actually have predicted, And
Mm.
then when the politicians are caught off guard, the first thing they do is they immediately blame the weather forecasters, and
Of
they
course.
get very they point the fingers at people like us.
We
And
never had snowstorms before in New
Yeah.
York State.
Yeah.
Joe
I
always
uh
gives me
I
these chances to do Andrew Cuomo, but go on. I'm
oh,
sorry.
funny, funny. Yes, former Governor Cuomo. I, not so much in the weather, but I can absolutely tell you that we've made some assessments. We Intel folks have made assessments in the past, mainly in training environments. It's not so often that it happens in real world, for a lot of reasons, but in training environments when we're wrong. And, that's for a lot of reasons, right? Inexperience or lack of data or whatever it is. And then we go and brief the boss and say, sir, this is what the enemy's going to do. And we're 80% confident. And then the enemy doesn't do that. And oh boy, yeah, yeah,
Well,
we
there's
can
the
get jammed up.
20%.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's not often the boss, right? It's not the, and when I say the boss, my echelon is a two-star general. He's the boss. That's what we call the boss. And so I've been in a scenario before where I was like a young warrant officer and we'll brief something and then the G3, so the colonel who's in charge of operations, he'll brief the two-star and it doesn't turn out the way that we thought. And so then the G3 will turn around and look at us and be like, yeah, but the intel guys told me that's what's going to happen. I was like, oh shit, thanks, sir. Yeah, I
yeah, I'm
appreciate it.
thinking
So
right
yeah.
now. I'm thinking right now of a scene from MASH, the TV show. It was one of the
Yeah.
earlier episodes where the general is there and he's waiting to see somebody, and I think it was Radar said, well, he's a little busy right now, and the general says, busier than a two star brigadier general.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Hey, yeah, it's funny you bring that up because I got to tell you a story just from today. So I was sitting in a staff meeting today with one. There's three two-stars in our state, at the state level. There's an Air Force, an Army, and then the ultimate adjutant general. They're all two-stars. And I was sitting in an Army meeting with the two-star today, and he was having a conversation, a very quick sidebar with one of the lieutenant colonels, and he wanted to speak to him after the meeting. And so he said, "Hey, Bill, or whatever his name was." He said, hey, you got a couple of minutes? I want to see you after the meeting. I want to talk about X. And Bill's like, hey, sir, I'm getting out of here. I'm going to be leaving. So I'll see you later. Like everybody in the room looked at him and goes, buddy, listen, when the two-star says you're going to meet me after the meeting, you're going to go meet him after the meeting. And he
Right.
doesn't give a shit where you're going or any of those things. So yeah, it's funny, but those things do happen.
Paul Roman on the chat board asks, "Do you think the advances in forecasting have helped or hindered responses in situations as they arise?"
Oh, 100% helped. 100%. And I can say that um, with with what's the word that I'm looking for? With confidence, specifically in reference, or I'll use the example of 2 years ago with the Buffalo Blizzard. That was really, really bad. And unfortunately, we did end up losing a couple of citizens here in New York. I think we lost like 14. But the weather forecasts that we had about what was going to be the end result and how damaging and how dangerous it was going to be were pretty spot on. And it's
They were
and you
spot
know,
on, and also they were early.
yes. Oh
They
yeah, no,
were
yep.
early. They were. I can remember from that particular event. The Weather Service officers were talking about this a full week before
Mhm.
it happened. For me, I think it's one of the a stellar moment, really, to to nail down something like that, uh,
Mhm.
far in advance.
Yeah, I'll tell you that we had, after action reviews. These are our, AARs that we have after operations. So we learn from all of the things that we did. And I can tell you with confidence that if that storm had hit, let's say 20 years earlier, and we had the type of weather forecasting we would have had then I am confident in saying we would have lost more lives because the fact that we got the information early enough allowed us in the Guard and our civilian partners to stage early and get our assets from New York City, Syracuse, and get them out to Buffalo. Get our Air Force, the Air Force runway plows that are used to get them out there in Buffalo and get them on the I-90. And it was still a challenge, and we still had soldiers going door to door and knocking on doors and trying to make sure that the elderly were okay and those that were unable to get out. It would have been much worse, and put it that way. So it's definitely helped.
Do you the way the latest the latest wave of technological changes is underway, and it's happening very, very quickly. and I'm referring to artificial intelligence or AI.
Yep.
And I'm just kind of curious because we already see businesses, or well, AI's been around for a while, but now with the NVIDIA chips and all the rest of it, it's really getting into every corner of
Sure.
of the business world, and I'm wondering, uh, how is it? Is AI starting to become part of one of the tools that you're using when having to come up with forecasts and making decisions?
Yeah. So I'd have to, I'd have to talk to my Air Force bubbas, my friends that actually do more of the actual forecasting. What I can say from generally speaking, in talking to some of my domestic response partners at headquarters here in Latham, New York, is that we do know that they're integrating AI into the future. As we've talked to some of our Air Force officers that said, there's predictions out there that AI, especially not even just with now's technology, wait till we get to quantum computing, that they're gonna be able to run so many scenarios that the likelihood of being off is going to be slim, and we'll get to the point where we really will be able to gather so much data from the atmosphere, from the ubiquity of satellites that are flying in the low Earth orbit, rather, that there will be enough data and there's going to be enough horsepower to analyze that data, normalize that data, and analyze it. That it's going to be, I don't want to call it easy, but it's going to be routine that we'll know what the weather is going to be, with
Well, it frees you
real
up.
certainty.
It'll free you up to do other things.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yep. And so that's even true. So when I joined in '97, the we in the Army, we would get the weather data from the Air Force folks, and they would give us very, very little. And it would take us in the Army, we would have to do a lot of data churning to really give the commander a clear assessment of what each and every aspect of the weather, visibility, cloud cover, all of these things, air pressure, how they were going to affect all of the aircraft and everything else, right? Um, we don't have to do so much of that anymore, which, because one, computers are helping us with that, and two, the Air Force has really kind of taken back some of that responsibility in terms of the actual data crunching. But I can say it with experience, or I can say it personally, that that's allowed us intel folks to get back to what we really need to be doing, and that is getting inside the enemy's decision cycle and trying to tell the commander what we think the enemy is going to do. It's going to be the same way with weather. It'll be almost an automatic process. You press the button, you get what the weather is, and now you can spend more man hours or woman hours doing other things.
I would think, and I'm just trying to visualize this, having to sort of figure out what the enemy is going to do. That's got to be the most difficult thing because it really sort of involves having you to get into their heads in a sense,
It
in
does.
in in,
Yeah.
in how to and then you have to make a decision based on that.
Yeah. So, yeah, the intelligence aspects of combat are some of the most challenging that are out there, and that's because you're dealing with such a wide, um, a breadth of information, not only with just regular data, right? And how many tanks do they have, and how fast can they drive, and how many gallons of fuel do they need, all the way up to how do humans make decisions. And, and we don't, at my echelon, we don't deal with things like what is Vladimir Putin going to do, but we do things like try to understand what the other division or corps commander is going to do on the opposite side of my unit. And so, from all the way to getting inside that core commander's head, looking at, and I'll just use Russia as an example, looking at Russian doctrine, looking at Russian history, looking at Russian tendencies, all the way down to the nitty gritty of, again, how many tanks do they have and how much fuel goes in there. We have to combine all of that stuff and then come up with an assessment for the boss so he can make that decision. And that's the thing that we do in Intel is we just the boss is the decision maker. And all of us on the staff, whether we're intel or sustainment or operations or artillery, whatever it is, fire as we call it, whatever it is, we're there to make the boss's job easier. So we do all the work, we grind all the sausage, if you will. We make assessments, we advise the commander, and we say, sir, this is what I think. But at the end of the day, it's your call, sir. And off we go.
But sometimes you get into trouble with the boss. I mean, sometimes You may provide the best data, the best information that you have, but if the boss is not somebody who is well versed in science, the boss will
Mhm.
say, I don't care what you're saying, I know more than you do, and I want you to do this. And that has happened in other cases over the
Well,
years and
it's
over the
happened.
decades.
It's happened to us.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I
I
remember,
can
I remember Khrushchev, for example, actually ordered his space agency to put a man into orbit so that he would be in orbit around the Earth on May Day, which was a big holiday in Russia. And the scientists tried their very best, those especially versed in aeronautics or whatever. But sir, Mr. Premier, we can't do that. It's not possible. And Khrushchev supposedly said, "I do not care. I want somebody up in it." And sure enough, they did put somebody up there. And sadly, that particular cosmonaut did not come back.
yeah.
He tried to re-enter the atmosphere at the wrong time because things were malfunctioning, and but that's the problem. I think is the fact that we have people again in the upper echelon who don't understand science well enough to accept what you're trying to tell them, and things like this, as Joe mentioned, we've had situations even here where that has happened.
Yeah. I what I'll say from my experience is that well, first of all, the military is absolutely a command centric organization. And so at the end of the day, whether we like it or not, we being the staff, whether we like it or not, the boss is in charge. And he doesn't have to listen to us. We can tell him till we're blue in the face that this is what the enemy's going to do, and this is the assessment of the course of action I think the enemy's going to take. And if he looks at me and says, Chief, I don't give a crap what you just said. I think the enemy's doing A. You're telling me B. They're doing A, and I'm building an operation off of A. Yes,
Well,
sir. Two bags full. It
you
is what it
you
is.
did your job,
Yep, I did. We
right?
did
I
what we
mean, you
could.
did your job. So,
Yep.
you know,
But what I want to make clear though is that again, in my experience, when you get to the level that we're at, working at a division level, meaning you have a 2-star command, and then you have a corps level 3-star command, and then army commands that are 4-star commands, the military leadership process is so good here in the US. I mean, we all have our knuckleheads. It happens. But generally speaking, the amount of people that come through this process, particularly the officers, you're not going to get to the level where you have 2 stars on your collar and operate that way. You're just, you're not going to make it. And even if you made it to say 2-star and you did something like that in a real combat environment and you ended up getting a whole ton of soldiers killed or something really went sideways, I can nearly guarantee you they're not going to be in command anymore. Now, what does that mean for the politicians who we ultimately answer to? That's a whole different ball of wax, right? I mean, we work for the civilian leadership in this country, and that's the way the Constitution is written, and that's the way it should be written. And so, and I can't even speak to that angle, but within the military structure itself, you really don't come across a lot of those. If they do exist, they make themselves known with their lieutenants, second lieutenants, first lieutenants, and captains, and the system kind of gets them sprung out and bounced before they get to a point where they can really make some, cause some damage, if you will.
I assume, by the way, that you don't want this to happen, but I'm just sort of thinking about the fact that with a forecast of 20, potentially as many as 2 dozen tropical storms and hurricanes this year, that it's quite possible that we could wind up having two landfalling storms someplace at the same time. And I'm just, just sort of in theory, I guess, wondering how do you juggle balls that way?
That's it's a great question. It's funny how much of a connection we're making here to what I do and what you guys do, particularly now. I just showed myself in the J3, so the Joint Operations Boss. We just showed the boss a map that highlighted the differences between the Atlantic Ocean temperatures in 2005 with Katrina and what the weather forecasters are saying the warm temperatures in the Atlantic are now, and the difference between the two, which is helping the meteorologists come up with this assessment. There's going to be so many hurricanes, right? And I showed the boss this differing map picture. And so, not to get too boring, but they're aware. And I
That's
can
not,
tell
you're not
you,
getting boring at
yeah,
all, sir. I'm just, I'm this is fascinating to me.
I can assure you that not only at my level, at the National Guard level, but all the way up to the governor's office here in New York, that this is something that we're preparing for. We and I'll give you a little bit more. There's something called an EMAC, and what that is an emergency relationship, basically, between National Guard states that already exist and are ready to be activated, if you will, operationalized in the event of a disaster. So, for example, we have an EMAC, we in New York have an EMAC with the Florida National Guard. So we've already made a promise to Florida that in some event we can give you X amount of soldiers, X amount of airmen, X amount of UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, whatever it is, and we put it all up in a document, almost like an MOU. And when Florida wants to come and trigger that EMAC, we're going to go down and we're going to help. So we're already refining these EMACs that we have with the other states across the East Coast, and we're having East Coast level conversations with all of the National Guard units and our civilian partners, knowing full well that this is going to be a busy season. So we're unfortunately we're just kind of waiting for it, and we'll be there to help as soon as we can.
I just got thank you, Wow TV helper. Was watching from Canada. Hopefully, he's writing down everything you say.
Sure.
Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
uh, Thanks for hitting the tip jar tonight. Thank you from WDWTV. That's what it says. Well, if you're working for a
Okay.
TV station, it's nice to have you on board. Where do you um where do you s- where are we going to be 5 years from now, or with with all the technology changes? You think?
Well, what do you mean? In what respect?
Well, is it going to make for I don't want to. I'll try to phrase this right because I don't want to say it the wrong way and make it sound
Yeah.
like something what I'm not trying to say. Um, is it going to? Are you going to be uh, streamlining certain things, expanding other things when it comes to emergency responses? Some things will be that you can't do now that you might foresee because of technology changes in AI that you might be able to do, say, 5 years from now or 10 years from now.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I could speak to any particulars other than the weather in terms of AI. I would say that we are getting better as a country. And when I say country, I mean all of us National Guard states working together. I would say we're getting better in our emergency management data sharing, our ability to see the same thing at the same time. So in a military context, we call that the common operating picture. So everybody's seeing the same thing at once. It's kind of a challenge to do that, and it has been for years between multiple National Guard states because we all have different commanders and we all answer to our own governors when we're not federalized. But the National Guard Bureau, which is an organization that is not in command of us, but helps kind of act as an umbrella organization for all of the states, and how we relate to Big Army, if you will. They've done a pretty good job over the last few years of getting all of the states on the same page and utilizing the same software and the same mapping tools and all those things. So yes, I mean the ubiquity of the internet, 5G access on our cell phones that we didn't even have 5 years ago, the ability to communicate like Zoom, right, which we have a government platform for, so we can share in real time while we're actually on the scene. So those things are already kind of happening, and I can already see them, can only see them getting better and better and easier for us to communicate going forward.
Are you getting a lot of compliments from folks on the chat board? Miss Fallerite, who actually she was involved in Army Corps, right there. I'm pretty sure I remember this, right, Miss Fallerite? You were involved in the Army Corps of Engineers and all sorts of other things with regards to the federal government. She says to give you a big hurrah. She's really enjoying
Oh, well, thank
this,
you.
as
Thank you.
have a number of others. And Sandy Q hitting the tip jar tonight. Thank you, Sandy. I think you're new to the chat board. Great conversation. She says, I spent 7 proud years with FEMA, traveled to many disaster sites, and worked with great people across all federal and state agencies. And,
That's great.
over the years, there have been instances where uh, FEMA, has got criticism, I think, in a couple of the hurricane responses. But this is not a. Everybody seems, and I say this all the time. It's just amazes me how many people, how many people know how to do somebody else's job,
Hmm.
and they're quick to throw criticisms, and they don't realize, they don't even begin to grasp how much is involved, how many people are involved, what it takes to coordinate a rescue mission, a project, whatever it is.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's a challenge.
and
It
I just
certainly
want
is.
to echo the hurrahs to you, sir, because we we have these situations where people's lives are at stake, and sometimes they don't realize it going in. Sometimes they don't pay attention going in, and you're the fallback guy essentially, because everybody goes is going to rely on you and the federal agencies and all the rest of it uh,
Yeah.
to to get things in order and do what you got to
Yep.
do in response to an emergency.
Yeah, it was I keep referencing the blizzard 2 years ago just because it's recent and just such a big event. Yeah, it was a hard day, hard couple weeks for us in at headquarters when we weren't able to save every life in Buffalo, and we were part of the response. And it obviously just isn't us, right? The PDs are out there, the fire departments. We have a federal response. Obviously, FEMA's if they're given the authority through the president, they're out there. But all of us as a group of agencies are, you know, just a tough week because we want to be able to do everything right. We want to save every person. But we're the ones driving around in 6 feet of snow and dealing with all of the challenges that come with that, and fuel and soldiers and food and power and everything else. And what I can tell you is that certainly leaders make mistakes. Nobody's perfect. Agencies fail sometimes. All of those things are true, right? But generally speaking, I mean, everybody is working at 100% and they're doing everything they can to get the job done.
Joe, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I just want to echo what a lot of people on the chat board have been saying over, especially the last 10 to 15 minutes, saying how much they appreciate John being here. Miss Blue Ocean, for example, hit the super chat button and said, "Great show. Thanks for the enlightening discussion." And I will second that emotion. I've learned a lot tonight, and I think as long as we have people like John behind the scenes doing his thing, I don't think we'll be in good shape when the next disaster comes.
Oh, well,
John,
I
for the
appreciate
late
that.
for the I'm sorry, for the latecomers,
Yeah.
tell everybody where they can find you, where they can find your podcast.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm doing a podcast called Headlines and History. You can find that on really any of your podcast platforms. It's out there. I'm also on YouTube with Headlines and History, and Instagram Headlines and History as well. I do some video clips there where I talk about current events and what it means to the U.S. Or there's a whole slew of stuff, right? I talking about the Iranian president who crashed in his helicopter
Well,
crash the other day.
there was an instance where weather was the player.
Yeah, I did a whole episode 12 on my show is just about that. Well, it was about the whole thing, but one of the points that I tried to highlight is that, when you take a Bell helicopter made in Fort Worth, Texas in 1979, and you try to fly that over the mountains of Azerbaijan in bad weather, usually
They're
or
going to have an
typically
issue.
or sometimes those things crash, right? And you don't necessarily have to turn and say Israel did it automatically, right? Which is half of the response you get on the internet, because if the Iranian president falls out of the sky, then of course Israel's responsible, right? But no, sometimes helicopters just crash. So weather played us an absolute role there. So, anyways,
Yeah, it actually brings. You just brought up another, one last question. How do you deal
I got
with?
plenty of time, Joe. Ask as many as you
Okay,
like.
great. That's great. Um, there's a tendency for, just in this particular example with the helicopter crash, the I don't know if they want to call them the conspiracy theories. They just
Yep.
start. We live in a world, and we always have lived in this world. my contention is we've always lived in this world. When something happens and the conspiracy theories start, it's just that everything is more, today everything is instantly magnified as opposed
Sure.
to taking weeks or months for it to get disseminated across a populace. But when that happened, there was, immediately there was this sort of trying to figure out, okay, there's people already coming up with conspiracy theories that Israel did this, or it was done by somebody on the inside in Iran, and all the rest of it. So how do you manage that? How do you chew through what's real and what's not?
Oh boy. Well, it's a two-part answer in that way. So from an intelligence perspective, I can tell you that, and I'm not going to speak specifically to the
I
helicopter
didn't
crash. I'm going
think
to
you
get,
would, and
yep,
I'm not
yep.
asking you to.
No, no, no.
I
Yep,
don't
yep.
want, I don't want to get in trouble either.
No, yeah, yeah. Oh, you wouldn't get in trouble. It'd be me, trust me.
I
But
don't want you to get in trouble.
yeah, yeah. So I'll tread lightly on that event. What I will say is that, um, in the intel world, we do have access to stuff, information that the general populace doesn't have access to. It doesn't mean we know everything clearly, but we do know a lot. And there's people. You look at the defense budget that the United States spends every year, and it is crazy, right? It's crazy. Let's admit it, right? We outspend everybody by miles. But what that does is it gives us, amongst a lot of things, it gives us the ability to know a lot of stuff. And we have a lot of sensors, and we have a lot of cool stuff out there. So we in the intel community, and then get an opportunity to kind of parse through some of the nonsense a little bit more quickly, because we just have more information. The challenge, though, is not so much whether we know the truth or not, and we can't know everything. Like I said, I want to make that clear, but it is easier for us to know. That isn't the challenge. The challenge is getting the right information out and getting it out quickly so you can move forward with your mission, right? And I'll use the example of the hospital attack with the IDF recently in Gaza that happened a few weeks ago. And immediately, as soon as the attack was executed and there were civilians inside of the hospital, it was immediately put out by Hamas that all of these five things happened and Israel wasn't paying attention and they intentionally targeted the hospital and they're just trying to kill civilians and blah, 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 right? And the IDF, and I actually just spoke to an Israeli military officer the other day, the IDF had didn't have all of the particulars. They knew what they did in the operation, but they didn't have everything in that moment, right? So they had to take 24 hours and go back and look at every single thing that happened in that step, every command decision, all those things. And once they got to that endpoint, they realized this was not a mistake. We did everything that we needed to do. There were all of these tunnels and all the stuff.
Right.
And but that was 24 hours after the nonsense was already out. And so now you're behind the curve and you can't win that battle. You
No,
know,
you never, you never catch up.
yep,
You
it's
never
too
catch up.
much. Yeah, so that's our challenge. It isn't so much knowing what it is that's true or isn't true or having a good idea. It's when we know what is true is then getting that information out, right? First of all, you have the biases that are built into human thinking and they're not going to listen anyways. But even the people that are on the fence, usually because of the way human minds think, the first thing that hits their brain becomes the truest. And so it's more challenging for latter information to uproot earlier information, even though the latter may be more true. It's just a human tendency. And so that's the challenge. There's so many benefits to having access to quite literally the extent of human knowledge on your cell phone. There's benefits to that, and then there's negatives, and you can see it happening every day.
All right, John, thank you so much for being here tonight. This was as I said at the beginning, this is sort of a different type of show for us because we're always, doing just pretty much weather stuff. So I learned a
Yeah.
lot, and I really, really enjoyed it. And thank you for taking the time out to come on the Joe and Joe Weather Show podcast. And we hope to see you again one day. We'd love to have you back.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me on. I had fun.
Joe, did you want to say something?
I just said John has an open invitation. Anytime he wants to come on and provide us with some illuminating information,
That
maybe
nobody else knows about? I'm just teasing.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
tend
yeah.
to be, I tend to be a little bit, I have a dark humor side and a little bit
Sure.
sarcastic. So, every once in a while it shows.
Yeah, I'll tell you what I can. Let's put it that way. You
Thank
can
you. Thank you
I promise
much.
you that.
All right. Thanks everybody for being here tonight. We're glad that you watched the show and hope you enjoyed it as certainly as much as we did. A lot of people are saying it was a fantastic show, and uh, we'll also, but this show will be on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and we actually do. I found out yesterday, guys. I found this show actually does pretty well on Apple Podcasts in the Earth Science and Science category.
Nice.
Sometimes we're in the top 10. Of course, there's only about 30 or 40 people with their science show. No, I'm just kidding. It's actually more than, at least several hundred. So, um, I was very, very much, thank you for reaching out to me and thank you for being on tonight. And we hope to see you soon.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Anytime.
And
All right.
Miss Balleroy wants to close out tonight on the chat board by saying maybe John would want to come back, do a hurricane recap in November. I have a feeling he's going to be very busy.
Yeah, let's put it on the calendar. Let's do it.
All right. No, we'll come back to you
Yeah.
later, maybe during hurricane season. We'll certainly, if something's going on. Are you able to talk to us during a situation, or don't want to get in the way of your work?
No, no, yeah, I mean, I would just be able to tell you. I mean, if I was on call or something was happening, I wouldn't be able to, but we have a pretty large staff, and if I'm available, then I'm available. I'll be here for you.
Great. Good to know. Good to know. All right, folks. Have a great night, and we'll see you. We'll be back tomorrow night at 7:35 p.m. Eastern Time. Night, night.
Good night, folks.